Hi, everyone. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. And today I want to discuss the Philosophical Investigations, which is a philosophical work by Ludwig Wittgenstein that was published in 1953. And I just finished discussing this with my philosophy discussion meetup group. We spent 7 weeks reading this and discussing. And I really enjoyed reading this. I will say I felt like I read this book at the right time for me. And I mention that because I don't think that the Philosophical Investigations is a work of philosophy that you want to start with if you are young to philosophy. I don't think that's the time for it. So for me, I have read quite a bit of philosophy. I was a philosophy minor in college, and I've recently gotten back into it the past couple of years, quite seriously reading things. And for me, I think what made it the right time is in part because I have explored different philosophies and I've always felt quite unsatisfied by them in some way. And so it was like a perfect time for me. And in particular, I took a class, or I sat in on a class on analytic philosophy this past semester, and um, and so this was a perfect book to read after you go through the progression of works in analytic philosophy. Um, Ludwig Wittgenstein's work is a very natural work to look at next. And the reason for that is the following. I'm going to go through some historical context before I discuss the philosophical investigations in particular. So, in particular, Wittgenstein is usually considered part of analytic philosophy, which, some of the names there are Frege, Russell, and more. But then later we have many others. And analytic philosophy tends to emphasize the importance of logic. So, a lot of these thinkers worked on logic itself, philosophy of logic, or just developing logic in some way. It also emphasizes a deep analysis of language because they're worried about the fact that, like in logic, we can be very precise, we can systemize everything. But then in philosophy, we have to use natural language, at least in some way, to connect up to the kind of problems we want to discuss about the world, about ourselves, and things like that. And so there's always going to be this concern for how the kind of purely logical arguments we can make in the formal systems of logic are related to the kind of arguments we make in philosophy when we write books of philosophy. So we can still be logical when we do this, but we're using everyday language, and so we have to be very careful about how the everyday language that we use connects up to the logic. And so, they're worried about avoiding logical fallacies like the fallacy of equivocation, where in two different premises of an argument, you use what seems to be the same word, but the meaning of that word is different. And so, although the logic seems to follow that the premises imply a certain conclusion, if you analyze the words more carefully, you'll realize that the conclusion does not follow from the premises. This is the fallacy of equivocation, and they're worried about sort of nonsensical statements that can be made in language. And in particular, one theory that was put forth by Russell that I want to emphasize for a second was called logical atomism. And the goal here, I think, in a very simplistic way, was to one, systematize language, like natural language, and relate it to logic. So he oftentimes would take a sentence and so-called analyze it and then explain how it can be made into like a very precise logical form. But then so you can analyze language, and then in the world he wanted to claim something about there being sort of atoms of sort of facts in some way, right? That like any complex statement could be boiled down to sort of very simple statements, and those simple pieces could somehow inform the truth or falsity of propositions in philosophy, something like this. But in order for that theory to make sense, you had to believe in some kind of ability to formulate a universal language that somehow all meaning could be brought into some, could be translated into some kind of universal language, and that in that universal language, one could formulate true statements or something like this, right? And I think floating around here is the goal of absolute certainty, right? I think Russell really wanted to establish philosophy and then his philosophies on a foundation that was absolutely certain and from which, all truth could be derived in some systematic way. And Wittgenstein actually winds up being a doctoral student of Russell. And at first, he is, reading. You can tell that he clearly read Russell's ideas on logical atomism and things like that. And Wittgenstein writes his what's called the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which was published in 1921, which was essentially his dissertation. And he claims in this work to have solved all the problems of philosophy. And in this work, I would say that Wittgenstein, although is not putting forth exactly Russell's logical atomism, it's in the spirit of Russell's logical atomism, where sort of everything in language can be boiled down to simple pieces. And then ontologically, like everything in the world can be boiled down into simple pieces. And these simple pieces of language, these facts, these simple facts, can be put into one-on-one correspondence in these simple pieces of the world. And then, so there's three regimes. There's the language. There's the language part. There's the actual world, the ontology of how the world works, and then there's the mind where these things meet. And so for him, where these things meet in the mind are what he called pictures, and these pictures can also be like put into one-to-one correspondence with the or certain facts in the pictures can be put in correspondence with the facts in your words in your language, and can be put into correspondence with the facts in the world in the ontology, and all this can be mapped out. Although he never claimed to like do the mapping in any kind of specific way, he's claiming that like this is what can allow the propositions of logic to be true or false, and he makes a lot of claims about that. And then at the end of the Tractatus, he makes claims about how. So he sets up this language and this correspondence between language and ontology and in our minds, but he makes it very clear that what can be stated precisely and carefully in language is limited. And oftentimes it's either somewhat empirical or somewhat analytic, like philosophy, like logic and mathematics. But then the rest of the things that we care about as human beings are like this ineffable things that we can't say anything precise about in language, but yet we still care about. And the famous quote there says something like, "Of which we cannot speak, we must be silent." So, of the things that we cannot say precisely in language, we just can't say anything about them at all. And this seems to suggest like the kinds of things that you would find in there are like the things that are in metaphysics and philosophy. And, this really influenced the logical positivists, which I don't want to talk about too much here in this video because I'm already kind of getting way too much into the background. Um, but what's interesting about Wittgenstein is that he eventually rejects some of the claims that he made in the Tractatus, and he suggests that he was wrong in the Tractatus, and that's where this later work, the philosophical investigations, come in. So oftentimes, Wittgenstein's work and ideas is separated into two parts. They call them Wittgenstein 1 or Wittgenstein 2, or early Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein, because there's a fundamental difference in his belief about language, which is in the Tractatus in Wittgenstein 1, early Wittgenstein, he seems to think that language there can be a universal language of some sort, and that it can be precise enough to give us some kind of absolute certainty about at least certain things, right? Maybe empirical claims or something like that. Although he grants that language cannot express everything, and so there are these ineffable things that are not able to be expressed in any kind of systematic way in language in the Tractatus. But later in the philosophical investigations, he doesn't reject this sort of limits of language approach to his philosophy. That's still here, but now he kind of doubles down and doesn't think that language is universal at all. And he does so he still thinks that like language is very limited in what it can express precisely, but now he takes that even further and says that it's like its limitations are all the way down. It's inherent in everything that we do with our language, that it's limited in what it can establish precisely and with any kind of certainty. So there will not be any certainty in this philosophy. To try to give you some idea of how that gets understood, Wittgenstein says, yeah, we all know that there are different languages. There's English and German and Spanish and Chinese, blah, 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 blah. You can list them on and off. But he's going to make even further distinctions, and he's going to talk about things which he calls language games. And honestly, we already have a somewhat of a type of a idea of what language games are, though we don't usually call them that. Like we already have an idea that like when I'm at the office, I talk a certain way. I don't use certain words, and I do use other words. And when I'm talking to my family, I talk a different way. Or when I'm at the bar, or in different contexts, we might use language slightly differently. But and that's part of what language games is about. But I think Wittgenstein's going a little bit further, and at least I want to sharpen it up a little bit more because he's saying that the words have actually very different meanings in these different language games, and we determine the way that these we determine how these meaning the words have meaning by how the words are used, right? Because there's no like way to systematically map all this out from scratch. The only way to understand the meaning of words is to pick up how they're used. Now, we kind of need an example here. So, one example that Wittgenstein uses a lot throughout the entire book is the concept of red, of color. And so, here's an example of a few different language games, right? When we do science, we can give a very precise definition of what red means. We might say that it's some sort of has some spectrum, and we give some reading that we expect to see if it's red, right? And when we do science, we can use the word red in that respect, and we can do science experiments where we can test whether something is red or not based on whether we see a certain spectrum of light on different objects and things like that. Forgive me if I'm screwing up the details of how that's done, but I think you get the idea of that language game. But his point is that when we use the word red in other places, we don't mean it like that at all. Right? When I'm using the word red and I'm trying to get someone to bring me a red object, like maybe a red apple, it might be the case that I'm trying to distinguish between two different apples, right? Maybe one is what I would call green, and the other one is what I'm going to call red. But let's imagine that that apple is actually not completely red. It could be actually more brown than red. But I might ask my friend, hey, can you bring me the red apple? And if the choices are between a green apple and this other apple, the person's going to know what I mean by a red apple, and they will bring me the red apple. So it's not so important that we agree about exactly what red things are in general in this particular context. It's in this context, presumably, what's important is that the person can recognize that I don't mean the green apple, right? And they bring me the red apple. And also, like his point is that in general, we're not able to define words precisely. Even things like chair, which goes, has a long history of being talked about in philosophy in various different ways. A lot of times, I remember my philosophy professor trying to explain Platonic forms by using a chair. So it's a good example in that sense, in philosophy context. But the point is that Wittgenstein's arguing that we never really can give a perfect definition of what a chair is, but rather we just need the people that we're trying to communicate with to understand what we mean by a chair in the particular context that we're in, right? And we can give like a working definition. Oh, it has four legs and a back, or we sit on it. He's not arguing that these things aren't useful descriptions at times, but I don't usually need to give that description in order to use the word chair. And if later on I'm using the word chair to describe something that wouldn't fit my definition now, but does fit the idea that I had previously about chair or the use that I want to have for chair now, could still try to use that word, and someone could try to understand it by how I use it, right? So I might point to a big boulder and say, "Oh, you can sit there. There's a chair." And someone might say, "What do you mean by a chair?" And I say, "Well, you can sit on it, And so he's very big on this idea that first of all, you cannot define language precisely. So that's a huge rejection of logical atomism and what he was saying in the Tractatus and a lot of the ideas in analytic philosophy. And that the way that you get the meaning of words then is by how they're used. You learn them how they're used. You look at what people are trying to use the words for, and you pick up the idea. And you don't get the precise definition because you can never precisely define words, but rather you just start to understand enough so that you can get something done in the world, right? That's all you need. You don't need to pin it down to some perfectly precise definition. Rather, you just need to get enough of the idea to do something in the world, right? To use language to produce uh, an effect. And I think throughout the philosophical investigations, there is this um, emphasis on language's ability to affect other human beings and affect the world. And so, I don't want to get too much into his private language argument. You can watch other videos about that. But basically, for Wittgenstein, there isn't a private language, meaning that like language requires other people because it requires, first of all, desire to want to affect the world besides yourself in some way. And it requires other people to respond to it. And since it's never like perfectly defined, in order for language to have any use, it needs to affect other people in some way, and that's how it affects the world. But I'll let you look up other videos on his private language argument. Otherwise, I will be talking all day about this. And what's interesting about all this is how this affects Wittgenstein's view of philosophy. So, Wittgenstein, in his later years, had this very controversial point. I think it pissed off a lot of other philosophers that there were no genuine philosophical problems, right? That all the different areas of science are doing useful things and are exploring the world. There's mathematics, there's all these different areas that are creating their own language games and using that to affect the world and are very useful. But philosophy, as a his goal is try to like understand all these things in general or ask questions about the meaning of why we're here or a metaphysics or ontology. He's very skeptical of this and wants to eliminate it, and via what he calls like philosophy is linguistic therapy, where we show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, meaning that the goal of philosophy should be to untangle different language games, and and by doing that we eliminate a lot of philosophical problems, is his point of view. So he says, are there physical objects, are there not physical objects? We can ask about these things, but um, this does not really have an effect on how we use the words, and it doesn't have an effect on our ability to use language to affect the world. And so we should keep these things separate. And he's very skeptical of philosophy of mind, where we try to take the things that are going on in our mind and connect them up with some kind of logical argument. He thinks that anytime we're doing this, we're making so many mistakes in how words are being used and what they mean, and it's just a bunch of nonsense. And what we need to do there instead is to disentangle all these different language games which are going on, and we will see that all these problems disintegrate before our eyes. I do think this is very interesting idea, and I mean, I suspect that there are still things that we could call philosophy after this, but I do think it's interesting idea that maybe we should be more careful about like what philosophy looks like and how we engage in that because of the pitfalls of language and because of the pitfalls of how words get their how words get their meaning. And also, this is interesting because it does line up, at least in the analytic philosophy tradition, of being very careful about what language says. The difference is with Wittgenstein that, um, at least in this later Wittgenstein, he sort of rejects all ability for language to do anything sort of precise enough or bring any kind of certainty to the world. But you'll also see this being grappled with with Quine and other later analytic philosophers. So it's not just Wittgenstein who grapples with this idea, but he's famous for it in this work. And also, he famously says that truth is relative because of this. And I just want to say here that when Wittgenstein says that, I think it's very important to understand the context that he's in. He's basically, the way I see it is he's saying that there's no way of achieving absolute certainty about the kinds of ideas in philosophy. And I think there's no way of achieving absolute certainty about anything. And I think he argues for that by just pointing out how fungible language is and how these language games that we play are constantly being made up, or we're constantly going in and out of different language games, and we can try to disentangle them. But I suspect that he even believes that like we can't completely disentangle them, that these words don't have perfect meanings. And so when he says that truth is relative here, he's saying that like language is not the kind of instrument that can establish truth. So whether or not like there is a truth about the world, whether there are physical objects, whether there is or isn't a God, whether all these different questions, like I don't know that he would say, or at least I'm not saying that there isn't a truth value to these things, but what he is saying definitively is that language is not the kind of thing that could establish the truth value of these things. And so we have to be silent about those things, right? And in that sense, early Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein is consistent, right? He's clearly the same person. He's still the same personality in his meta philosophy and his approach in a lot of ways, but his views on what language could do have drastically changed. He now thinks that language is not capable of providing any kind of absolute certainty to things. And so in that sense, truth is relative, right? And from a practical perspective, truth is relative is what he's saying. Like, there's no way to establish one philosophy as correct and another philosophy wrong. There's no way to establish science as being correct. There's no way to solve the problem of induction, which has been around since Hume, but I'm sure before that. There's no way to solve the problem of cause and effect and all these different things in philosophy. So what's left is, or at least the way I think about it is, what's left is a sort of pragmatism. Although he never lays out pragmatism in any sort of explicit way, it's clearly in the background in what he's saying that like, why do we make up the language we do, or why do we use the languages to affect the world we do? Is because it's useful, right? And I think that's his view of science as well. He doesn't seem to have a problem with like physics or these different areas of science because they have an effect on the world. They have an effect on how we do things, and so they are useful, right? And a lot of the things we do are useful. But what I think he's skeptical of is in philosophy, where we take these language games and we try to create theories that supposedly tell us things about metaphysics or ontology, which is inherently not useful and almost by definition cannot have an effect on the world, and so should be avoided. And we just make all kinds of mistakes in language and things like that when we do that. Um, so honestly, for me, I actually so far, I mean, I've read, I just finished reading it, and we'll see its long-term effects on me. But I find this actually quite satisfying. I find it satisfying in part because for me, um, I think I've been wrestling with this idea of absolute certainty since I was a teenager, and I've been skeptical of absolute certainty my entire life. I grew up in a Christian family, and I believed Christianity very strongly. But as a teenager, I started to question Christianity very. I wanted to understand Christianity at its core. I wanted to understand every detail. I mean, it's a part of my personality to deconstruct and want to understand. I didn't want to lose my faith. But after a while, after like an 8 year journey, I did lose my faith and I considered myself an atheist. But the reason I lost my faith was because of the fact that I was skeptical of the idea of faith. I was skeptical of the idea of believing something without evidence and things like that. And I was skeptical that you could be certain of Christianity or anything else. And I felt like if I can't be certain of Christianity, then I shouldn't believe in it. Of course, there's an issue with that because then what should you believe in, right? Like, if you can't be certain of anything, there's kind of two roads. Either you try to find a way to be absolutely certain of something and then you believe in that, or you never commit to anything because you can't be certain of anything, right? So I preferred the second route. I didn't want to believe in Christianity by some kind of blind faith or just wholly committing to it. So I preferred the route of just keeping things gray, right? Lots of things in the world are gray. We don't know the answer, whether they're true or false, and that's okay. Like the world, most things about the world are just gray area, and and we just have to accept that, right? We just have to live with the gray area of life. But I think in the back of my mind, there was still this desire for certainty. And I still wanted there to be some, even if I couldn't find it, I wanted to still, set my sails towards it, right? I thought maybe we could approximate it better or something like this, right? And I think, I'm a mathematician. In some sense, I think I'm attracted to mathematics because of its promise of a type of certainty. And I won't go into here how I think about that quite yet, but I don't think math is absolutely certain in the purest form, but I do think it's one of the most certain things that we do as human beings. Certainly the most one of the most stable um, things that we do as human beings. Um, and I see the philosophical investigations. I think it has like done a little bit of linguistic therapy for me, as sort of being the last stone to be thrown at this idea of absolute certainty for me, and to kind of let go of it completely. Whereas looking at the history of analytic philosophy and going through some of Frege's ideas and Russell's ideas and all the other people, I think was kind of going through the timeline of things I would have been very much caught up in if I was born in that timeline. I would have wanted to work on those things, and I would have been hoping for the kind of certainty that that could have produced. And then Wittgenstein comes at the end and puts the nail in the coffin, but for me, in a very satisfying and actually feels good kind of way, to say no. There's nothing that is absolutely certain, and yet we live anyway, and yet we're going to live anyway, and so. I'm not going to tie this up in a loose end for you. Maybe I'll do some later videos to react to what this means for me. But I think there is something useful here. I'm sure many people respond to the philosophical investigations as sort of depressed about it, and I understand that. But for me, I find this as refreshing because I think it's just incredibly honest. I think Wittgenstein is just incredibly honest. I think Russell was incredibly honest too. I think he really wanted absolute certainty, but he wouldn't have been dogmatic about it. But I think Wittgenstein is being incredibly honest by just showing us that, we have to accept this very part of language that we will never be able to establish things with absolute certainty, but yet we can do useful things, and yet we can affect the people around us, right? And it just helps us. I think it helps us to emphasize that which is important. So I would encourage you to read it. I will say the Tractatus is almost impossible to read. I don't recommend people reading the Tractatus, though if you do, I recommend you finding YouTube videos to help you read it, or read it as part of a class that you're sitting in on or something. But I do think the philosophical investigations are readable, but it is difficult, right? It's not something that you read again as the first jump into philosophy. You need to study a lot more philosophy first. He's going to take a lot of philosophy for granted. He's going to comment on a lot of other philosophers. You need to have read at least the greatest hits of analytic philosophy, because he's going to comment a lot on these people, but he's also going to comment on a lot of other philosophers, and he's not going to be very explicit about it. And it's written as a series of aphorisms, so it's a little bit of a funny style. I actually really like it in the philosophical investigations. I think it's a great style for what he's trying to do, even though I really dislike it in the Tractatus. So it's a difficult read, but I would encourage you when you're ready, when you feel like you're ready, to dive in and let me know what you think. Find some people to read it with so that you can discuss it with. This is definitely a book that benefits from the ability to discuss it with other people and get their ideas. And let me know what you think. Comment, like, and subscribe. And I hope to see you at another video.